Well, that was a little bit more than a minute or two, but we're going to go ahead and get started, try and get us back on track. I thought that was a fantastic opening to our program to hear from the Commissioner. And as I mentioned, some of her comments are a great lead into both of the panels that we have set up for today. So for our first panel, it's focused on collaborative infrastructure with perspectives on public engagement. This panel is going to explore how to strengthen stakeholder engagement through the transmission planning and development lifecycle. And for our moderator, we have Margaret Neves, who will be leading the discussion. Margaret, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to make the introductions, or however you would like to do it, and get us started off with the discussion.
All right, great. Thank you, Larry. So, boy, what a great segue Commissioner C handed us for this discussion. And I also want to thank Larry. This conversation actually started at the summer meeting. I am a career communications professional in the energy industry, and so it was really interesting to hear that folks in the audience during that meeting had some questions on communications and what's the proper timing and everything. So really happy that we were able to pull this into a panel discussion and having such great panelists on deck to have a really interesting perspectives, I think, on this topic. So my name is Margaret Neves. I am in a business development role at Jacobs Engineering, which is a global consulting firm. We are focused in the energy industry for engineering and environmental, but as I said, my career is actually in the communications part of the industry. I worked at National Grid for about 10 years, where I stood up their stakeholder engagement team. It's now taken on a life of its own. It's led by some really talented individuals. And then when I left for the consulting field, I was supporting utilities and developer clients with their stakeholder engagement planning and strategies. So really happy to be here and having this conversation. So let me turn it over to the panelists to introduce yourselves. And Stacey, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Stacey Burbure. I'm the Senior Vice President of Transmission Business Development and Joint Ventures at American Electric Power. I'm responsible for our competitive transmission development team and also for our RTO policy and strategy. AEP is, of course, the largest transmission owner in the United States, and we participate in 4 RTOs: SPP, MISO, PJM, and ERCOT.
Commissioner?
Sure. I'm Dan Scripps. I'm chair of the Michigan Public Service Commission. I was appointed by Governor Whitmer in February 2019 and appointed as chair in the summer of 2020. By background, I'm an attorney. I actually practiced law here in DC and served one term in the Michigan House of Representatives as well. And during my time on the commission, have been actively involved in a number of transmission-related initiatives. I serve on the organization of MISO states, and I've served as president and held a number of other roles in that as well. Currently chair MISO's Regional Expansion Criteria and Benefits Working Group, or RECB, which is responsible for cost allocation, and did that as we developed the cost allocation underpinning MISO's long-range transmission planning process, and also served for 3 years on the NARUC-FERC Transmission Task Force in the run-up to Order 1920. So it's great to be here.
All right, thank you. And last but not least?
Thank you. Bob Kuzman, Executive Director of MISO, responsible for the states of Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, Wisconsin, and the great state of Michigan. I guess today when the Commissioner was talking, I thought in my mind, I have a chance as a small town lawyer that never thought they could be in energy policy and a legislator for 11 years in Indiana, and then a partner doing, I'll call it gaming legislation. I guess I'm in the energy business for the last 11 years and work at MISO, so have a great team that supports me and supports some of the stakeholders that are here, and looking forward to a good conversation today.
Of those states, do you have any favorites? All right.
Yes, I do, because the Commissioner's from Michigan. So I'll stick with Michigan today.
All right, well, thanks, everyone. And so the way that I've sort of tried to structure the conversation, at least, and there's no structure to this, we're all friends here, we'll talk about, things as they come up. But I've tried to take it from a project life cycle. So we'll start from the very beginning, and, we've all heard the phrase early and often when it comes to, when to start the messaging and what the messaging should be. And so the first question I have is, how can we best message the importance and benefits of transmission projects in a way that effectively answers the concerns of all stakeholders, whomever those stakeholders may be, as to, do we really need this project? Bob, did you want to start with that one?
I think, we were just at the OMS meetings, and the overlay of everything you're hearing is affordability. And how do we balance affordability with economic development? Because it's important today. And on top of that, a reliable system that we need to maintain. Talked a little bit about aging infrastructure that needs to be obtained, and the continuing building of more transmission and generation. So at MISO, I think, we have been very successful in Tranche 1, long-range transmission planning, and also Tranche 2, long-range transmission planning. And, in Tranche 2, I think I added up a tad bit over 80 stakeholder meetings. Now our TOs in the room are probably saying that was 79 too many. But I think the important thing is that we do what we can in the stakeholder process to educate every sector that we have in MISOs, from your transmission-dependent utilities to your competitives, to your TOs, and then your power marketers, and I can go on. But I think it's important that they have a voice, an opinion, and we respect and evaluate every piece of comments that are filed when we ask for comments on our tariff and also on the projects. But I think and then once it is approved by our board, I think we do a very good job and need to continue to support our TOs and our competitive transmission developers at the local level too, to show that there's that reliability assets that's not, yes, it may cost something, but it's making the system a lot more reliable, and MISO is sort of out of the way of the economic development for the states that need these, that are requesting data centers or data centers going, and also the remanufacturing going on.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I'll just add, part of what is so critical is the education piece. So Craig alluded to this earlier when he was discussing the West Virginia line. So emphasizing the benefits of the overall system to customers and how the system works together, and the integrated nature of RTO planning, rather than examining the specific benefits of only a single line in isolation and the impact of that. It's really the participation in the RTO itself overall that provides those benefits, but that's a complicated story. Most people don't know what an RTO is and couldn't tell you what the acronym stands for. So how do we embed that into our education piece with landowners? And to your point, early and often. And the time that you spend in that engagement with landowners on the ground, with the people who are going to be impacted by these transmission lines, these are 100-year assets, and we have to be mindful that these landowners are going to have to live with these transmission assets in their line of sight for the next 100 years. So how do we work with them? How do we engage early? Can we make adjustments to the siting path? Those are really important conversations to have.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and particularly that last point, as you get into the local siting, and ultimately states largely have responsibility for that. And I think that there's an awareness that these projects, in some cases, are necessary, but where they go and how they affect landowners, often who have been on that parcel of land for 100 years in some cases, particularly in rural areas and farming communities, and the sort of respect of the landowners, if there are modifications that can be made, if there are multiple routes that can be considered, I think that helps build confidence that the one that ultimately was selected, wasn't the only one that was looked at. And here are some trade-offs that were considered and ultimately addressed in this way. And that, I think, helps give confidence to regulators as well as we're reviewing site plans to say, we've got a fair amount of confidence that even though there are going to be some challenges, I don't know that there's ever going to be an unopposed project, that ultimately the diligence was done, that the communications took place, that landowner concerns were heard and listened to and respected, and where deviations of the initially proposed route could be made, that those things were at least attempted. That makes our job a whole lot easier at the end of the day in what are always, I think, going to be inherently controversial projects.
Yeah, no, that's true. And for those who haven't developed a stakeholder communication plan, it's typically set out in phases, right? So you want to, depending on the project and depending on what the siting and permitting regulations are, you can't always be as early rolling out that project to the general public, right? Any thoughts on just how early and how transparent to be and at the stakeholder, at the public level?
Yeah, I guess I'd encourage to go beyond sort of what the law requires, and particularly as routes are being considered and developed, that in Michigan, the requirement in submitting an application, I won't get too into the weeds, but is essentially one proposed route and one alternative, and the landowners need to be noticed on both of those. Other interveners can come and propose alternates to that, but there are due process issues with if those people on an alternate route that's proposed by an intervening party haven't ever been notified, didn't know that this might be a result that could be in play, that's a real challenge. And so I think instead of just looking at two routes and that's where you start the engagement, start with half a dozen. Start with everybody in sort of the area that could be considered, and my sense is that you'll get a sense pretty quickly of which routes are actually feasible and which are not. And at the end of the day, you might still just propose those two routes, but having people engaged in the conversation and looking at the trade-offs between different parcels, between different routing strategies, I think, again, helps to make sure that the ones that are proposed are really the best, and that people have been engaged in that process involving their land at the end of the day from the beginning.
As early as possible is really, I think, the key there, because it's the most significant impediment to getting transmission built. So understanding the landowner concerns, understanding where deviations might be helpful, understanding where a landowner might want a truckload of gravel for their driveway, right? If there are things that you can do in the construction process or to work with landowners to accommodate their concerns, to move around a barn on their property or something specific, right? There are very concrete things that you can do, but you have to have that awareness, you have to have that engagement, and that requires early and often, including them in the process and talking with them directly one-on-one. This isn't something that can be solved with a website. It requires very active community engagement.
I have a friend who's a wind developer, and he measures it in megawatts or cups of coffee per megawatt. And it's that approach of just sitting down at kitchen tables and doing the work.
You have to sit at the kitchen table, and that time that you invest, that saves you so much. Yeah. It saves you in terms of litigation. It saves you so much on the back end in terms of community engagement.
So I'm going to show my age now, because when I was working at National Grid, I was out there at folks' kitchen tables, and I got a lot of Facebook friends out of it. I haven't been on Facebook in a very long time, but if I did, I guarantee that probably 20% of my friends on Facebook are from that particular project. So, but it brings up the topic of social media. You want to sort of control your messaging as best you can so that it doesn't get out of control. With social media, you could run up against, maybe the first folks that you've engaged launch a campaign within their communities. And always a difficult position to be in, but we can kind of broach that subject when we get towards the end of this discussion. So another part of early planning for these projects is doing a demographics review of exactly, who it is that you're speaking to, what the concerns are, maybe doing some research on previous projects that might have been opposed, knowing what the sensitive receptors are within that community and other sensitivities. Are there any approaches that you can think of that have been really successful in addressing some of the conflicting interests that might come from within a particular region or communities?
Well, I can start a little bit.
Sure.
When MISO took the first approach on our long-range transmission, we needed some quick hit projects. So we looked at land that was already being utilized, how we can improve lines so there wasn't the issue of the taking or trying to create new lines. It worked very well because we see those projects moving very quickly because there's not the land acquisition, there's not the sitting down at the coffee table, and brings back my state rep days of getting yelled at for long periods of time, but that's okay. But I think it's important that we as an RTO and utilizing our planners to look for routes that we can improve, that they don't have, the transmission owners or the competitive developers don't have to go out and do that. One, it allows the system to move faster and utilize that transmission at a quicker rate that we need to help the economic development and not hear from the farm bureaus or whoever else we hear from in the fields. It makes it easier for everybody, I think, if we can start that way and look at that approach.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? So environmental justice is an area that is important to make sure that these projects aren't being built in areas of regions or communities that are underserved. Any thoughts on the best way to approach those? Not the best way, but is there a different way of working with those particular sectors that you can think of?
I think this is maybe the most important place for early engagement and understanding the sort of, not just the issue with the particular project that's being proposed, but the sort of cumulative burdens that environmental justice communities often have faced. That it's not just that the transmission line is being proposed there, it's that everything gets proposed there. And that is beyond the responsibility of anybody in this room or this industry, but it's absolutely where environmental justice communities are living their lives. And so we have, in Michigan, developed over the last couple of years what we call the MyEJ screen, or the Michigan Environmental Justice Screening Tool, and it really looks at a whole lot of demographic information, sort of average median income by census block, and really trying to understand what are the communities that are most disadvantaged, and then how do we, in the engagement with those, be respectful. But it also provides an opportunity to then, on a pretty granular level, show the benefits. And so we have had questions on the distribution side of, are the places that are most disadvantaged also the places that have the least reliable service? And we found, surprisingly in my mind, no, actually, that they're in a lot of cases. And so what we've seen more recently is, as utilities are proposing distribution plans, that they are targeting benefits, that there are places where they're saying, we understand that this area in particular is hard hit, and as a result of these proposed investments, we can see meaningful improvements to some of these disadvantaged communities. I think the same is absolutely true on the transmission side. So trying to use the data that's available and be as granular as possible with the benefits that will accrue, particularly to disadvantaged communities, I think can go a long way.
Yeah, that's great. And you bring up a good point, too. That's not just the transmission project. Anything could be proposed in those areas. Yeah. So that's really good information. So I want to shift to technology. Just your thoughts on any new, evolving, or maybe technology that you'd like to see as part of these project proposals, whether it's in the design or any other tools that really help the public engage on these projects. Stacey, did you want to lead with that one?
Sure. With respect to technology, this is an area that AEP has been innovating in for a long time, along with many other utilities. But in particular, 765 kV technology is one that AEP really innovated because it was so efficient in terms of our disparate service territory. So we energized that first line in 1969, and we're really excited to see the growth of that technology across the country. So it obviously features prominently in MISO's Tranche 2.1 plan. ERCOT has announced a big build out in the Permian Basin, and we're hopeful to see expansion in SPP, which is going before the board in the next few weeks. But in addition to that, we've also innovated what's known as breakthrough overhead line design. So a new transmission tower design that is lower in height, so aesthetically sort of more pleasing to communities. It's more efficient in terms of carrying transfer capability as well. So continuing to innovate there, and also going back to Commissioner C's remarks, how do we also ensure that we're using the existing system? So last week, it was announced that AEP received a $1.6 billion loan from DOE for reconductoring. So all of the above. What can we do new? Where can we innovate? What can we do differently? Because we have a significant challenge in front of us. With respect to siting, there's also information. How can we use AI? How can we use new technology to improve our processes, to speed forward, to meet the opportunity in front of us?
Yeah, I would just pick up on two things that Stacey mentioned. The ability to get more out of the existing system. We often think about that from a cost containment perspective, and that's absolutely critical. But it also helps, I think, in saying this line that we're building, this new line that is going to require additional properties to run across, we're doing it after squeezing out all the value that we possibly can from, and that helps with the justification that we're maximizing the value of the additional system, but more still is needed. And that's an easier thing to accept from communities than this is sort of the default that we're just going to build more. And that, so both cost and ultimately infrastructure that's deployed in communities. And the value of trying to even in the LPO example, swap out essentially low interest rate debt for other, for market debt is tens of millions of dollars in savings. And so it's a great example of how do we be more efficient in this, take advantage of the opportunities that are out there. And I hope that program will continue. I think we've seen across the sector a lot of benefit that it's provided for customers, and it's often infrastructure that's going to be built one way or another. It's just how much is ultimately going to be charged to the customers at the end of the day.
I was talking to a colleague of mine yesterday. We were kind of going back in time, and it wasn't that long ago that we were utilizing like weather balloons to indicate the height of the towers and sort of taking a picture and trying to get folks that would be impacted by that to say, well, that's basically what you're going to be looking at. And so the advances in the visual impact analyses and all of those simulations it's come such a long way, and I'm really excited to see where it goes, because that's, I think, to me, one of the biggest ways to message around some of these projects is really show people what it's going to look like and stick to that, make sure that it does look like that when the project is all done. So the last question I have before we open it up for questions from the audience is, you can do all of these things that we've talked about today, and you've done everything according to the book, according to your plan, you think you've done everything right, and you still have opposition. What to do in that regard? Because we all know that opposition, when it really affects the timing of the project, it starts to get really expensive very, very quickly. So any thoughts on how to deal with opposition when all else fails?
Sure, I'll take that one. So certainly TransSource, with respect to certain projects in PJM, has encountered significant opposition over nearly a decade. And so a project that actually started out as a reliability project sort of transitioned into a reliability project because the same driver was there. It was really about congestion. But it's a very tricky conversation. And again, sort of Craig alluded to this, what happens in an RTO framework where one state views itself as a loser, or that the benefits sort of aren't as commensurate, with other states in this RTO framework. So there's litigation, which is of course the path of last resort from a utility perspective. But ultimately, you can also continue to engage in the community. We reach a settlement with the impacted county. We have continued to engage and see if there are alternate paths that we can take in order to alleviate concerns. So where required, litigation is sometimes a necessity. But certainly that engagement, you also can't stop. Right? You have to really lean into the problem and see where you can find a solution that works for the impacted communities and also meets the needs and objectives of the RTO.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make the strongest possible case that you can. There are commissions, state commissions that are pro-transmission. There are state commissions that are more skeptical of transmission. And don't make it easy for a skeptical commission to reject your project. Don't make it hard for a commission that broadly sees the value in transmission to approve it. And that starts with benefit metrics. I know, Craig, you mentioned that the recent Court of Appeals case largely takes the question of need out of states, at least in organized markets, but still show the need. And on the citing, the actual parcels involved, the more voluntary agreements that you can get. I realize every project's different. That's not always possible. Communities organize really quick and then they all say no together. But the more you can do to make it a lighter lift, I think the more successful that you're going to be. We realize that, there's lots of reasons that we have some level of independence and that, there's longer terms and the ability to remove commissioners. It's because we make hard decisions on infrastructure and rates pretty regularly. And I think we understand that, and that there are going to be landowners who at the end of the day just are never going to be supportive, but the harder the decision is, you don't want a situation where you ultimately get a rejection, even a rejection that is later overturned by the courts, because that's 10 years where you're litigating instead of building. And if you can give us the best possible case, I think commissions in general understand that these are challenging decisions and that people are going to be frustrated, but can support it as long as we've got the record in front of us and have seen the work that's been put into the project, so that things like eminent domain are a last resort and not a default. And that sort of thing goes a long, long ways.
Yeah.
I'm good.
All right.
They did a great job. I'm just going to hang back. I'm still thinking about the Michigan State fight this weekend, so I'm just going to wait and stay out of that one.
So any questions from you folks out there?
Does Larry get to ask questions?
I'm going to go ahead and start, and then we can pass it off to some other people. But I think this is a great discussion, and I think it was really interesting to hear some of the suggestions. But at the same time, I keep thinking, this is starting to sound like quite a conundrum to me, because a lot of what you're talking about in terms of engagement, when I hear 80 stakeholder meetings, when I hear coffee at the kitchen table with every landowner along the path, when I hear dropping off gravel for the driveway of different landowners, all I keep thinking is, wow, this is a big investment of time and effort on the one hand in order to get the objectives met. At the same time, we're increasingly hearing we need it now. The timeline is shrinking in which we need to try to make all of this happen. So I'm trying to figure out, are there ways of collapsing or consolidating all of these outreach, engagement efforts, or do we have to basically say, no, we need to do this, we need to take the time in order to do it, and we just simply can't meet the timeline that you're talking about? Where are we on that? I mean, maybe we don't have an answer, but that to me I keep thinking, how do we resolve all of that?
There certainly is a tension there, Larry, but the time that you save in terms of that upfront engagement, it more than pays for itself. So it's going to cost you time one way or the other, but you do need to start early, and that can come at a risk, right? Communities can then sort of engage, but you have to be invested in that. And communication is difficult. As you well know, it's not something that utilities usually do very well, right? This is a complicated process. How do we explain it in a way that impacted and affected landowners really understand the overall value proposition, the future economic development that this transmission build can bring to communities, ensuring that we are telling a holistic story about this need that is really vital, right? And in terms of the long-term investment, to the region as well. So there's certainly a trade-off, Larry, and it is absolutely a challenge.
Go ahead. Yeah, I agree with Stacey. I think the other challenge is if I think you could get some quick wins, but I think you then will see backlash from state legislatures, from other landowners on other routes who say, I see what you did over here. And so it's I think tempting to say, well, the law is the law and let's just do the minimum and get this project through, but I think it will make it hard. I mean, it's not just tranche one that we're going to do. I think this is the new reality that we're going to build large-scale transmission infrastructure for the next foreseeable future, and I think that makes it all the more important that, particularly in the early stages, that we're doing the work and doing it right. But I will say, I think you're right to point out the tension because, you can solve problems with different approaches. And if transmission becomes a decade-long project, but you can get generation online in 2.5 years, then you're going to build a lot more generation, even if that's not the right optimized result for customers. And so it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I wish I had answers, but I am concerned that if you make it too hard on the one side, that water flows downhill, and we'll find other ways to meet these needs that may not ultimately be the right path, but it becomes the path of least resistance at this moment.
From the RTO side, I think it's important that we help economic development with our expedited transmission projects that we have, that we can get those transmission lines built as quickly as we possibly can, or the owners can. But I think the process of starting to develop the futures that we're working on now that's going to lead to the next long-range transmission planning, or what we're calling it now, the Midwest transmission planning. Change the names on me all the time. Have to maybe keep up with the communications. But I think we as an RTO need to build that economic base that our members can go out and utilize for the commissions and for the ratepayers to show their cost-benefit analysis on that, to see that it is wise to build this large transmission line because it, in the long run, will save you money rather than building generation. And that's our obligation to do, and we are doing that, and hopefully have some futures out by the first quarter of next year that will start bookmarking where we can go in the future, not only on resource adequacy side, but also on the transmission side.
Great, we have a question up here.
Yes, Ben Lands, ABC Media again. So I love the premise of the panel. I remember some of the conversation at the summer meeting, and we're talking a lot about how do we communicate when we're building a project, but at some point there's going to be a cost that will likely hit somebody's bill. How do we get in front of those additional costs when someone sees it's going to be an extra $2, $10, whatever it is on their bill? How do we get out in front of that to communicate the total life cycle cost, the return to the benefit of society? What are some examples of some successes where we've been able to have those necessary increases to pay for these great projects, but ultimately there is a customer ratepayer cost? How do we get out in front of that?
Yeah, I think and I think MISO has done a good job with this, that you can meet, as I was just saying, needs different ways. You can meet them with transmission or generation, and if you do all of it with transmission, that's not optimized. If you do all of it with generation, that also isn't optimized. But how do you find that sweet spot between the different things that can fill that need? And I would say, going beyond that, it's not just sort of within RTOs, but between RTOs too. Sometimes the best solution is going to be an interregional project, and so that's an additional level of optimization. But if you've got confidence in the planning process that's identifying what is the right mix of transmission and generation, and that's necessarily, I think, a conversation between the states and the RTOs, that I think will help. That yes, this part of your bill is going up, but this part of your bill may be going down, or maybe going up less than it otherwise would, which is the absolute hardest thing to communicate. But that piece, I think, is really important. And then the benefit metrics, and what are those, and how much of those are cost, how much of those are reliability, but it's difficult to quantify, but something that all of us across the political spectrum can agree on. To the extent that there are things around decarbonization, there are states that's not of interest. And so do the benefits still exceed the costs, even if you just pull that completely out? And do they in each state? And I think MISO's done a good job with that, of identifying a pretty robust set of metrics, quantifying those that can be quantified, and then zone by zone showing that every zone in MISO that is looking at this has a net positive benefit to cost ratio, even when some of the decarbonization benefits are removed. That, I think, helps build confidence that these ultimately are worth it. And particularly if you can do both strong benefits and an optimized planning process, I think that goes a long way in saying that there may be costs involved, but this is actually the best from an affordability perspective, as well as the other benefits that are being proposed. Sorry, Bob, you probably wanted to talk about your own process.
No. Nope. My favorite state's Michigan.
So that all makes sense to me, but I've been in the industry for 30 years. But what if I'm just the average customer sitting in my living room couch, and I get this notice in the mail, or whatever it is, whatever the notification is, that my bill's going up? What do we need to do? Take out Super Bowl ads, or like to get out in front and say, hey, this is what we want to do as a society, right? And right, you're not going to be paying, okay, maybe one simple little case, maybe electrification. Maybe we're going to have more electric vehicles. Maybe we're going to have more heat pumps. Okay, great. And that has a benefit to society, but that's going to come as a cost, but you're going to be paying less fuel costs. How do we get out in front of that to communicate, hey, is this where we really want to go as a society? Well, this is the cost, and this is the wallet. Like, you're going to trade this cost for this cost. How do we communicate that to the public so they can anticipate what's happening, and it's not just a hit to the wallet, it's a trade?
Yeah, I think that piece of the value proposition, I think when Uri happened, when Elliott happened, I think there were real sensitivities that, okay, I understand, but as you get a couple of years out from that, the sort of benefit of reliability, I think, sort of gets, that project that is now being built 7 to 10 years after the incident that maybe triggered it, helps to make sure that doesn't happen again, or to lessen the likelihood that happens again. And the piece that I think is most challenging is, we've seen numbers that are pretty significant in terms of transmission build. When we've looked at that at the Michigan Commission and as part of the MISO discussion, solving those same needs with more emphasis on generation alone would be 5x that. And that part is hardest in part because there are, there are people who build transmission, there are people who build generation, and the generation folks come in and say, look at all that money you're going to be spending on transmission, without sort of saying the other part. And I think it really is incumbent on the folks building transmission and the RTOs, as well as the states. I think we've got a responsibility to say this actually is significantly less cost than the other alternatives that would be on the table. And a lot of times those get optimized internally in vertically integrated utilities. Where there aren't vertically integrated utilities, I think we have to make sure that we're connecting the dots in the public mind, that this really is an optimized solution that is least cost, most value.
You're asking the question of how do we tell the story around affordability? And I don't have an answer for you, but I know it's going to take everyone in this room to figure out how to tell that story, because it's really essential. And, you know, do we tell it through what happens if we don't build, right, and the lights go out, and compare it to cost savings there? What are the costs of a blackout? That's astronomical, right? Do we tell it in terms of the context of what happens if we lose this artificial intelligence race that we're engaged in? What's the cost of that? Right? What's the cost to national security if we lose? Right? I think there are so many ways to think through that question, but all of that isn't sort of easily captured in a soundbite. But that's really the challenge before us as an industry, is how do we also explain, right, that today we've all sort of enjoyed the benefits of a system that was paid for by prior generations, right? Now the bill's due. So, and it's going to be our future generations that really benefit from this build out. So when you're talking about 100-year assets, right, the impact of how you pay for that might be disproportionate depending on your birth year, right? But how did we get to a build out of a national highway system? Right, I think that's also something that's often looked at, but it's a true challenge in front of us as an industry, and I appreciate the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great discussion. Thank you for that. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Michael Brooks with RTO Insider. I think one of the things that Craig from PJM said was that the people in West Virginia are opposed to building transmission for data centers specifically. And you know, a lot of what you said makes sense, you know, trying to explain affordability and reliability to customers, but a lot of people, normal people, don't want these data centers, period. And I know you're not in charge of the data centers themselves, but they're very skeptical of AI. They're very, maybe even fearful of it. So how do you explain that, you know, we need to build this transmission line to serve data center load when, forget the transmission, they don't want the data centers themselves?
I think probably every RTO and every state is, not every state, I was joking with somebody where their rates were higher and they said that's not an issue that we have in front of us. So, but a lot of states are, and Michigan is, and I think one of the things that we need to just be cognizant of is, I think there's a concern that this is adding a huge amount of costs to the system, and costs that are not ultimately going to be paid by data centers, costs that will be paid for by other customers. I think it's the responsibility of all of us to make sure that the data centers are paying their fair share, their full share of the costs that are being imposed. If that happens, I think there's the real opportunity for upside. That the story of the 20th century has been that a rising demand has helped us pay for the system without spikes in bills. This is lumpier, obviously, than what we've seen up till now. But if we can ensure that both in the short term and the long term, the data centers are paying their full share of the costs that are being added, and then all of us have the opportunity to benefit by having the fixed cost of the system be spread out over more kilowatt hours of sales, then I think you can get beyond that. But I think a lot of the concern around data centers and AI is these are massive costs that are being added to the system, and I don't have a lot of confidence that they're going to pay all of them, that some of that is going to fall on me as the customer. And I think all of us have a responsibility to make sure that the full costs that are being incurred are ultimately being paid for, and that the benefits then of a larger system ultimately can accrue to all of us.
And I'll just add that this has certainly been a question that's been top of mind for AEP given the growth of data centers in our service territory, and we innovated a state retail tariff that we filed in Ohio to protect customers under a take-or-pay construct. And we've worked with data centers, we've worked with large load customers to ensure that there's a framework in place at the state retail level so that customers are protected.
Yeah, we're seeing that across, at least for the central region that I work with, is that some legislators are getting involved, legislation saying that if a data center comes in, they have to pay the cost. They can't separate that off from the present customers. You see commissions taking action that way too. I know my home state of Indiana has something that was passed last year to sort of protect that customer and making sure those costs of the data centers. We all talk about data centers, but there's a lot of remanufacturing going on, especially in our southern half of our footprint, that seems to be coming in too. The data centers get the attention, but there's a lot of other economic development going on throughout our footprint in MISO.
I can't see over the podium.
Hi, my name is Christina Hayes with Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and we are a nonprofit that works to support high-capacity transmission around the country. I'm really interested in your conversation around engaging with communities early and often. It seems like with siting processes, basically the utility shows up, or the developer shows up, and then the people who are grumpy also show up. We've done a ton of papers and resources on talking about the affordability aspect, how essentially building out a well-planned, well-developed grid provides benefits of $5 to 1 for every dollar invested in transmission. So it really is a tremendous benefit cost proposition for customers. How can we better engage with you, and how can we better engage with the siting processes to make that case to those who will be making the decisions that will really have an impact as to whether or not transmission is able to move forward?
I'll start first, and thank you for your support and help on our Tranche 1 and Tranche 2 projects. Thank you. I'll leave the other questions on siting and stuff because we sort of step away from that area. Our job there is to support, and we need to do a better job supporting our members at the local levels with what Chair Scripps talked about on economic benefits and taking it down to the lowest granular value so the customers can actually see what the cost benefit analysis is.
Yeah, I'll just add my appreciation, Christina, for the efforts of ASEG. You and your organization have been leaders in terms of putting together information and reports for utilities on how to approach siting issues and emphasizing the value of that early and often engagement. And again, I think this communication piece is really critical. This is a difficult message. So to the extent that we can sort of engage as an industry, as broadly as possible to tell this story, which is very nuanced, I think is critical.
I'll just round out the ASIG Love Fest with my appreciation as well, Christina. We describe ourselves, as most state commissions do, as a creature of statute, that we need to follow the law. And so we've got statutory tests in each of our cases, including in transmission siting cases, and that has to be demonstrated on the strength of the record before us. And having the reports that you produce, and then the people who then pick those up as intervening parties and put them on the record. We earlier this year approved the first large-scale transmission in a decade and the first interstate transmission line in half a century. And what was interesting is that in addition to ITC, who is the applicant in that, we also had a number of intervening parties who were supporting ITC in both demonstration of need and in some cases reasonableness of route, and using things like ASIG reports and the demonstrable value of what transmission can provide. And so having those in the ecosystem and then available for intervening parties, both the developer and transmission supporters in contested cases, to make sure that we have a strong and robust record on which to base our decisions, it's difficult to overstate the importance of that.
So I think we're going to bring the panel to a closure, but Margaret, I wanted to see if you had any final wrap-up, or if you're ready to go ahead and just bring it to a close.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this has been a really great discussion. Stacey, you had said something when you were answering the question on the data centers, and you said it takes everyone in this room to sort of talk through those issues, and I would love to see this conversation keep going, and this collaboration among us, you know, within the industry, sharing lessons learned and some of the challenges that you know, one developer or utility is having, to be able to reach out to, you know, others within the industry, excuse me, and really, you know, keep this dialogue going. That's what I would love to see. So again, I appreciate you and Wires for opening this discussion up.
Well, great. Would everyone join me in thanking Margaret and the panel for the discussion? So we're going to take about a 15-minute break. I think there's coffee and maybe some other things out there for people. And we'll resume in about 15 minutes. Thank you very much.